is the New South Wales president of the RSL. Very interesting suggestion there that it should be, in fact, the Australian War Memorial that is in charge of coordinating and running these services around the world to commemorate Anzac Day and other commemorations. We'll contact the Australian War Memorial and Brendan Nelson and see what he's got to say about that. But I'm certain many Australians would support that, because the War Memorial and Brendan Nelson have done such a great job in so many other ways. I want to go back to this climate change and climate action story now, and the $2 billion announcement made by Prime Minister Scott Morrison earlier today. I'm joined now from Canberra by Dr Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute. Thanks for joining us, Richard.
Good afternoon.
Now, Tommy, $2 billion tipped into more climate action. People like you who are at the hard edge of pushing for more and more climate action, how could you possibly quibble about this?
Oh, I wouldn't quibble about it, except to say it doesn't go nearly far enough. I think that, you know, Tony Abbott, it was of course Tony Abbott who signed us up to the Paris targets. It was Tony Abbott that created the direct action policy. And while the direct action policy always could play a role in helping Australia meet its emission reductions targets, the targets set by Tony Abbott, it was never capable of doing the heavy lifting. So what we're seeing today is the coalition government putting a little bit more money into that bucket, but of course that bucket isn't nearly big enough to put out the bushfire that is the challenge of tackling climate change in Australia. Well,
Australia is not going to solve global climate change. There's nothing Australia can do to actually be the one to cool the planet. But the first order of business here is to meet the Paris Agreement emissions reductions targets. Now, there's been some conjecture as to whether or not the government's policies are on track to do that. They have said they are. Surely this additional $2 billion would convince you that Australia, under these settings, will meet its Paris reduction targets by 2030.
No, there's no conjecture at all. The government's own department says that we won't come even close to meeting the targets set by Tony Abbott. The department's own forecasts say that by 2030 we'll miss Tony Abbott's targets by a long shot. The conjecture you refer to is some commentary by people who don't accept the science of climate change, and they don't even seem to accept the science of accounting principles. So, but again, that doesn't mean that putting a bit more money into Tony Abbott's direct action policy won't make a bit of a difference. It just won't go far enough.
Hang on a second, though. With this additional $2 billion over 10 years, do you accept that? Notwithstanding what you say about the previous forecast, do you accept that this will make up the difference, that with this additional spending, those Paris commitments will be met?
No, it won't go close, but it will push us further in the right direction, just not nearly as far as Tony Abbott committed Australia in Paris to going. I mean, let's be clear, when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, on behalf of our nation, he committed us to meeting those targets. And at the time he said that, he said, Australia doesn't back away from commitments it makes on the world stage. And his minister at the time, Greg Hunt, was in Paris hoping to get Australia into what was called the coalition of high ambition. Greg Hunt wanted Australia to be seen as one of the countries that really was leading the global charge to reduce emissions. So those targets set by Tony Abbott are very important. The money announced by the Morrison government today won't go nearly far enough to meet the promises made by Tony Abbott, but I'd rather have them than nothing.
What we need is a Tony Abbott mentions reduction scheme going on here. You're very keen to mention Tony Abbott. Yes, Tony Abbott negotiated those Paris targets. They were ratified.
He signed us up to them. He signed us up to them, and good on him.
He negotiated them, and they are Australia's commitments. The Australian country has signed up to those commitments. They were ratified by the Parliament under Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, and they remain Australia's commitments. Indeed, the Labor Party supports them now. They just want to go further. Do you accept, though, that these direct action policies, the beauty of them and the sorts of projects that are going to be funded by this additional $2 billion, the beauty of them is, apart from reducing emissions, they deliver ancillary benefits. They deliver tangible additional benefits, such as perhaps improved forestry or land management on farms, improved costs when it comes to energy efficiency, and improved use of farming and agricultural land.
Oh, absolutely, which is why I said I welcome the new money being spent. The Australia Institute's research makes clear they have the potential to make a positive difference, just not nearly enough difference to see us meet the commitments that we've agreed to make.
You talk about the cost of all of this and how far will $2 billion go. We've seen the modelling from Dr. Brian Fisher last week looking at Labor's doubling of effectively of our emissions reductions targets. And he's talking about a $472 billion cost to the economy over 10 years, something that would take $9,000 off the wages of each and every worker.
Oh, I know Brian's been trying to scare us for decades. You should have seen what he was publishing back in the 90s.
Well, it's pretty easy to be scared.
Okay.
Have you opened a power bill lately?
Oh, well, I've watched the power bills go up since we got rid of the carbon price, and I've watched Australia's emissions go up since we got rid of the carbon price. So, I'm watching very closely. The fact is, since the Emission Reduction Fund became our primary climate policy, emissions haven't reduced. They've gone up. Emissions have gone up every quarter since we got rid of the carbon price, and topping up the Emission Reduction Fund, according to the department's own forecast, won't get us close.
So bottom line is you want a carbon price.
To the commitments Tony Abbott.
Bottom line is you won't be happy that we get a carbon price.
Like nearly every economist in the world, yeah, I think a carbon price is a very simple way of doing this, but it's not the only way of doing it. And again, the Emission Reduction Fund isn't evil, it's just entirely inadequate.
Richard Dennis, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Richard Dennis there from the Australia Institute, the Green Left perspective on all of this. As he says, the sorts of carbon emission reduction projects that this fund supports, anybody would support no matter where they are on politics. The big debate is whether Australia goes on to meet its Paris commitments. The even bigger debate is what on earth will that do to the global environment while global emissions are still growing at more than twice the total every year of Australia's total emissions. That debate will be going right on to Election Day and beyond. But we're going to take a break now. When we come back, something just a little bit more lighthearted. The Oscars. Let's find out what